and community. The situation is serious. It's urgent, but the message was that there are things, in fact, that we can do. This track of sessions, I think, is an example, one of many examples in this summit of the things that Penwar does particularly well. Go deep on a subject, bring together the people who have something to contribute and have the ability to help craft meaningful, actionable solutions. One of the comments from the last session from Dr. Grenz was the status quo is the easiest thing to do, but it just doesn't work anymore. The utility space in wildfire is really becoming something of a crucible. And really policymakers, companies, the technology companies, and others who support the industry are all coming together to develop a range of solutions. I'm going to quote someone who's not from the Penwar region. This is Pedro Pizarro. He's the CEO of Edison International, and we all are mindful of what happened in Southern California and Los Angeles. This is something that Pedro actually said even before that particular crucible. But the concern that that electric companies have been put in a position of essentially underwriting what is a societal risk that is being driven by climate change and that potentially breaks the regulatory model. And utilities do have an important role to step up to be a key part of the solution, but they can't do it themselves, just like rural communities in British Columbia, in Washington State, in Alberta can't do it by themselves, as we heard in the last session. Puget Sound Energy CEO, closer to home, Mary Kipp, helps lead the entire electric industry's work on wildfire, and she's spoken thoughtfully about the increased frequency and severity of wildfire and extreme weather. She's emphasized preparedness and proactive measures and the value of technology investments, including advanced monitoring and grid management. And she's focused especially, I think, on community engagement and collaboration. If you heard Josh yesterday in the lunchtime plenary from Puget speak at a high level about their wildfire work, he emphasized community engagement as one of the primary parts. So here, for the next hour or so, we're bringing together leaders from public policy and regulation, from the utility sector, and from wildfire technology. All of them, though, although they have specific responsibilities, are people who are known and respected for thinking very, very broadly about the subject. We'll explore how the region is addressing wildfire risk, from utility fire mitigation plans and emerging technologies to the evolving landscape of insurance, equity and investor concerns, and federal and state policy. We'll discuss what's working, what gaps remain, and what policymakers need to prioritize to ensure resilient energy systems in a fire-prone future. We have, if you have a chance to look at the app and spend some time looking at our discussants' backgrounds, these are really extraordinarily accomplished people in this area and in other areas as well. Commissioner Ann Rendell from the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission is also, among many other things, the first vice president of NARUC. NARUC is the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And this November, you will become the president, adding even more responsibility and probably more commutes from Tacoma to SeaTac to really be present all across the country. Anne also really was key in starting and helping now to lead NARUC's work on wildfire. We'll spend some time talking about how NARUC and Anne are contributing to really important national work. She has a master's in public policy from the University of California at Berkeley and a JD from the UC San Francisco. Michelle Vargo is Puget Sound Energy's Senior Vice President for Energy Operations. She has a very deep background in the utility sector. She has an engineering degree from West Point and an MBA from Chicago. Dr. Joaquin Ramirez is the founder and now Chief Technology Officer at TecnoSilva. He has a forest engineering degree from Madrid and a PhD from the University of, help me with the pronunciation, Lleida. Very good. And you have also been an industry leader, I would say more specifically, a leader in best practices around wildfire, forest ecology. And it turns out that you and Paul Hesberg go way, way back and are co-conspirators in some of the most critical efforts in this area. So I'm going to ask each of them to provide some opening remarks, then we'll go to discussion. We'll use the app. We also will have a roving microphone if you want to get into the discussion live. Joaquin, let's start with you. As I mentioned, you've been focused on wildfire for years. You work both with electric companies such as Puget Sound Energy and also with governments, whether that's in California or the province of British Columbia. Tell us a bit about TecnoSilva and how the challenge of addressing wildfire has developed over the years. I think you have some slides too.
Thank you, Bob. I think I have just very simple slides to introduce ourselves. Thank you for inviting me here to this wonderful forum in a moment that I think that we really need to show the partnership, not only between borders, but also between the different partners. As Paul Hesberg mentioned before, this is an all-hand job. And well, at TecnoSilva, we've been trying to provide, when we try to reduce the risk, that's our mission as a company, reduce the global impact of wildfires and extreme weather. The first thing you have to do is to understand it and to quantify it properly. And that's been our focus all the time. Provide to every partner that we work with, and not only utilities, but wildfire agencies, provide that metric. Once you know what is your risk, then you can do, what can you do to be proactive to reduce it, right? So we've been working, now we're standing at 29 years as a company, and they're in Spain, but we incorporated my US company. We started everything in Bellevue. So I'm extremely happy that we are hosting this conference here. I'm supporting my son, which is a husky. And really, I think that for me, it makes a total sense that we have this conversation in this place that has such a wonderful relation between all of us, right?
All good things happen right here in Bellevue, is that right?
Everything happens in Bellevue. Yeah, don't tell that to Microsoft guys. This is more important. To do that, I mean, this wildfire science that really supports all this understanding, that was our focus. It's a very young science. I used to say back to my friends that deal with floods is that the Romans knew very well about hydraulics and hydrology. They built aqueducts 2,000 years ago. But the fire science was born in Missoula, Montana in the 50s, and at the same time in Alberta, also in the 50s. And that's one of the reasons that we keep learning and we keep facing new challenges by trying to understand the phenomena that we're facing. And when we look at the past history, we look at the 2015 fire season here in Washington, 2016 in Fort McMurray. I can continue 2017, what happened in British Columbia, in California, where I'm right now, on and on and on, Alberta, Canada, 223. What we're facing is at a dimension that is at the border of the science, at the very fringe of the science. And we are trying to address this, to provide all the information and the analytics that utilities and wildfire agencies can use to be proactive, because we have to be proactive. What we're facing is absolutely extraordinary, right? So this is one example of that collaboration, trans-border and with agencies. We have, as this fire season, we're working on one side with your partners at the US Forest Service, Region 5, Region 4, or Region 6 here in Oregon and Washington, with the Missoula Fire Lab, that was that birthplace of wildfire, but also with British Columbia wildfires and with Alberta wildfire. On the utility side, we're working with Puget Sound, but also with Idaho Power, with Portland General, with Pacific Power. And the beauty of this is that we are all in the same boat. I used to say that there's many actors in this arena. Some of them are rowing in one direction. There's another one that are not rowing in that direction. And I'm going to be very open and clear because I'm a Spaniard. I think that the litigation industry is one of the big problems that we're facing together because they are not part of the solution. They are part of the problem. They're focusing that the problem is who starts the fire, and that is not the problem. Because fires are going to happen, no matter who starts the fire. Sometimes it's going to be a lightning strike, sometimes it's going to be a bad practice, and sometimes it's going to be an accident. But our communities, our industries, our people are going to face those fires no matter who started this fire, right? So just have a little example of how this science works, because it's a little complex. I have a little video that I think is running. That's a simulation of fires in Idaho. Try to understand very, very precisely what is the potential impacts of wildland fires. That is continued by something that I'm very proud is British Columbia now is using the American and the Canadian science. I love the two flags because those two sciences were not working together in one place. They are working together in British Columbia now. And also I have an example of Alberta. Fortis Alberta has been our first customer that is using a newest AI trained model that also includes the Canadian fire danger rating system, but also the American fire danger rating system together to provide the decision-making process. And the last one was Puget Sound, which is evaluating all the extreme events with a 25-year reanalysis of weather conditions that we built for the Pacific Northwest. So that's basically what we do. By the end of the day, being proactive to reduce risk, you need to understand the risk as precise as possible. And that's kind of the role of Tenosilva in all of this.
I always appreciate you highlighting the role of the forestry school at the University of Montana.
Oh, yeah.
So go Grizz, I suppose I should say, coming from Montana. Michelle, I've been in meetings where the point was made that, well, Puget, I thought that was really kind of an urban company, really an urbane company. But in fact, fire is a real risk for you. It's been a priority. Give us some background. Tell us about your service territory and how this has emerged as something that the entire company is really focusing on.
Yeah, thank you. So again, welcome to Bellevue. Your headquarters, my headquarters is here. So you've battled the Washington State traffic to get here. So congratulations, you made it this far. No, so happy that we could take this time to update not only what our utility is doing in response to the wildfire risk, but our partnerships to my left and my right here on this panel. So Puget Sound Energy makes up traditionally what people think about with Seattle is mostly the western part of Washington State, and people, joke and comment how wet it is here. And so it is really important that we understand that this is an evolving risk. And as the risk has evolved, so both the frequency and then the consequence of wildfire, because as we see with the temperatures rising, that the riskiest months of the year, we're extending that. So where we might have only had to focus on in August or September, we're really and sometimes starting to really focus on wildfire season late May, early June. And then this is carrying us all the way into, the winter months. And as we saw down in California, you can even have the conditions come together in the months that you wouldn't think you would be dealing with wildfire. So as this risk has evolved, our strategy has evolved. And I think in the utility space, we're often grounded in the hazards that are present to just operate the grid. We have WAC, and in other states you have OSHA that have evolved our safety standards and practices. This is about public safety. So as the conditions have changed, we are also evolving our playbook to meet the needs of our community and help address those and reduce the risks that our communities see, because inherently, as we point out, there will be fires. And, depending on what statistic you read, utility related fires, wildfires, make up 3 to 10% of the fires that we see. And so we want to do our part. We're accountable to reducing our part for a wildfire resiliency for our communities. And I can't highlight enough, and Dr. Ramirez talked about this, but the partnerships that have really allowed us to move as quickly as we possibly can in this space. I am so grateful for the partnerships that we have with the California utilities, but even here in Washington State, we work very collaboratively with Avista. We're just open playbooks. We're sharing everything that we're learning. We absolutely need to do that on behalf of our communities. And then we have partnerships with great technology companies. We are a TechnoSilva customer. We wouldn't be where we are today in understanding our risk, our system risk, and then our day-to-day operations, the integration of that information so that we can take real-time actions to mitigate risk. And then, of course, we heard in the introduction the work that my CEO has been doing and Commissioner Rendell. All of these things are coming together to make sure the utilities can do their part to reduce this risk.
Commissioner, you are busy. You are getting busier year by year and month by month. Why did you decide that this issue was so terribly important that you were willing to commit even more of your time to it?
Well, I've grown up in the West. I grew up in California, and wildfire has always been an issue, but it's become more significant lately. It's become more significant over the last 10 years, and I think commissioners in California, Washington, and Oregon, and even those in British Columbia have come together over the last few years to talk about this risk and how we can deal with it. And I have to credit Commissioner Houck in California and Commissioner Tani in Oregon for, and Commissioner Decker, Chair Decker, former Chair Decker in Oregon, for really coming up with the idea of some sort of a focus during my year as first vice president of NERU to really focus on wildfire, not just as a Western issue. It's a whole of, it's an everybody issue. It's all over the US, it's all over Canada. It's really a significant risk for communities, it's a risk for utilities, and then it's a risk for customers because it's a significant safety and financial risk for utilities, which means it's a significant financial risk for customers who really need to receive that safe, reliable, affordable service. And state utility commissioners, we have financial and in some cases operational oversight over utilities. Investor-owned utilities in Washington, we set the rates that customers pay for their service. And so we have to make sure those rates are fair, just, reasonable, and sufficient, and so that the utilities can recover the costs that they need to pay for that service, but that it is fair to customers. And we have to remember that utilities, electric utilities, provide a critical life-saving service to customers. We rely so much on electricity, not just for turning lights on and for our heat, but also for communications. They power the pumps for water companies that provide the water service to our communities. There's so many different things that electricity provides to our communities. And so it is a critical service, but it also has to be done in a way that is safe and affordable. So that's where the commissions come in and the work that NERUC is doing. And I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it is really, and having listened to the panel just before this, it really is an issue of maybe we can't continue to keep doing things the way we always have and have to think differently. It's helpful to have the technology companies like TechnoSilva and others who are really aiding in providing the mitigation efforts that utilities are engaged in. And also the effort that NERUC is doing is really to provide that education for states, both the utility commissioners and the consumer advocates, and really understanding what the issues are that utilities are facing financially and operationally due to wildfire, among other resilience issues that they're facing. And so how do we provide guidance for the states in that way?
One thing, as a customer or as a citizen, you should be aware that all of these people are deeply involved in associations that share information, best practices, but really make significant progress on policy, on strategy, in this case, strategy simply to deal with fire. Reminded of the aphorism that a definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and thinking the result is going to be different. That doesn't apply here. You can do the same thing over and the result can be a whole lot worse because the situation is changing in many cases so rapidly. Michelle, let's go deeper into what Puget Sound Energy is doing. If you could give us the elements of your strategy and then how you see it being executed.
Yeah, so we focus on four foundations to our wildfire program. First is situational awareness. Obviously, our partnership with TechnoSilva is a critical component of that. And so we have both a static view. So we sit down on an annual basis, review what improvements we've done on our infrastructure, also any sort of community inputs that have changed, make sure we understand where our highest risks are on our system. And that then informs activities that we do going into the high risk months, but then also not only the static view, but the real time view. So we have inputs that come into our control center daily, and they are within 100-meter accuracy. So we're trying to be as precise as we possibly can be in making decisions for reducing risk for our community. So that's our situational awareness. We also have our grid hardening. In many cases, you've probably heard of undergrounding. So when you think about the way that the grid interacts with the environment around us, we really want to, of course, minimize outages in general, whether it's wildfire season or not. So we want to be reliable for our customers. But in the event that there's an asset failure or there's contact with vegetation, how can we reduce that risk? So what are the actions? So there's vegetation management. There's tree wire, there's settings that we can put in on the system so that they're more sensitive to de-energize during high risk conditions. So those are the types of things that we're doing on the grid hardening piece. Community outreach, our partnerships with other agencies that have responsibilities for community resilience. So in the state, DNR, but also at the state level, we do a lot of work with Department of Commerce's emergency or energy resiliency and emergency management group. We actually try to coordinate our efforts in that area so that we can also think about, our communities don't know where our lines end and where someone else's lines start. So we need to make sure that our solutions are comprehensive and our communication and outreach crosses those boundaries for our customers. So I think that's our comprehensive approach. But then there's also just layers. So when you think about the sequence of fire, we have day-to-day operations, how we run the system on any blue sky day. We're obviously doing things to make the system as reliable and resilient as it possibly can be. But then we're also monitoring when our risk is increasing. So what are the things that we're doing? So we have a operational procedure, critical wildfire operating procedure. And so as we see the weather system coming, what are the actions that we're taking on the grid to interrupt potentially that sequence of the fire threat? And so, in some cases, we might change the setting on the system, as I discussed before, but then the other action that you're probably familiar with is a preventative shutoff. So we call it PSPS, Public Safety Power Shutoff. So if the conditions are such that we think there's a high likelihood that there will be an event on the system, we de-energize the system for public safety for those communities, because we just do not want to take the risk that if there is an ignition of some sort, that we're not propagating it in the conditions where the fire would just take off. And then after the event is over, lots of work goes into how to restore customers as quickly as possible. And all through those events is communicating with our customers. Just this year, we've made sure that our outage map can convey what status our system is in. So if you have questions, and also the paradigm shift, even for our own employees, our employees, thank goodness that they are willing to go out in all sorts of conditions to restore services. But in this case, if you have an outage and you have those settings on your distribution system where it shuts off to avoid a potential ignition, our first responders are not going to go out there and re-energize in unsafe conditions. We want the conditions to pass so that when we do re-energize, the conditions are safe for an energized system.
So you do PSPS you get a phone call for 1 or 2 or 3 or 10. How do you both communicate to customers and citizens why this is important and communicate with them as you're going through the process?
Thank you. So one of the things we do is at least once a year, we have meetings, public meetings with the utilities, and have the utilities come in and explain what they're doing with their wildfire plans. And we started this about 4 years ago, and there's been significant coordination and collaboration between the utilities to really up their game. And so, it's gone from, well, what are you doing for a mitigation? What are you doing on your wildfire vegetation management? What sort of technologies are you using? What are the technological things you can do, like the settings on the lines? How can you sectionalize those to make them less impactful? But mostly on the communication for our customers. How are you engaging with the communities? How are you talking with them about this? And our communication staff are engaged with the utilities communication staff. We want to make sure that those customers that are really reliant on electricity for medical equipment or otherwise really vulnerable in some way, that they are getting the message from the company in various ways about that this is coming, that if there's a safety setting, that they might have the potential of losing power, and also for PSPS events, which I guess we're beginning to have. But I think the other thing we need to do is communicate with the public from the commission generally, and we're doing that through the governor's office and working with the state emergency management division, so that when power gets turned off, that the message gets conveyed to customers correctly as to why the power turned off. I think last year or the year before, sometimes emergency management staff and first responders can tell the company, you need to turn off your line because we have a fire coming into the area. Well, then customers think it's the company that turned off the power or made the decision to turn off the power, where it was actually the first responders who needed the power to go off, and making sure that that is effectively and correctly communicated to the media, because they can decide that things are a certain way when they're not actually. And so making sure that that communication is done effectively to the community, to the media, to the government officials involved, so that everyone has the right information when something happens. So that's what we're trying to do.
Does Technosilva contribute to the analysis that goes into a PSPS event?
Well, I think it's important. I think the 3 pillars that you described about being ready and mitigate, then be ready in case that a PSPS happens, and being able to communicate to the public, that is critical. That's something that we learned, for instance, in San Diego. We started to work with SDG&E after a fire that really was put the company at really risk. It was a $2 billion fire. Then we learned that with Pacific Gas and Electric, $13.5 billion that put the company also in bankruptcy. And at the end of the day, the impact is for all the citizens. That is making really hard to run the businesses with that kind of threat on top of that. So for the PSPS, which is that kind of running the business, a very atypical day, because everybody works for providing, affordable energy to everybody's life, whether it's for running your business or for keeping a critical infrastructure in place. Then all of a sudden, we need to take that decision, because we're facing those streams that may jeopardize the lives of many. But to do that, what we try to help is by being as surgical as possible. After 2018, to give an example, Pacific Gas and Electric faced this litigation, huge. And then 2019 happened, and then there was some PSPS events. PSPS events that put close to 1 week with no power into Silicon Valley. So, okay, we have this problem. There was no surgical tools there. There was just a decision that was extremely impactful. Since that moment, we're able to identify why PSPS is important. When you show, in the case of, for example, trees that hit the line, on those conditions, what could happen? And that helps to understand both regulators, but most importantly, the public, why this is important, and why dealing with fire is not a firefighter's business only, which by the way is a terrible concept. Fight fire is something that is a bad business. We need to be fire managers, all of that, and the solution has to come from the citizens, bottom up, by understanding that they have to be part of the solution, and by understanding there is not enough firefighting. There's a prevented PSPS conditions that are going to happen. On one side, you may be told you have to evacuate, but on the other case, you may be told, okay, well, be ready. Have your generators. There's wonderful programs that the utilities in California are sharing with others how to make our societies more resilient. And we try to support that by giving the analytics to be surgical, to be efficient, and try to be ready both before and during the event.
So you might work with a public agency to help them prepare. You might work with an electric company to say, be ready, you may need to deploy PSPS here. On the other hand, the technology potentially gives you more visibility to shrink the area and shorten or manage the duration as well. So that's a response to the public upset over having their power turned off. Great. Talk a little bit more about the elements of the NARUC work. This is a big deal, and a lot of people are doing a heavy lift around this.
So thanks. So what we were doing is we decided we needed to create a resource for state regulators and consumer advocates, and also bring the utilities in and other partners in to really develop a resource to understand the wildfire financial risks and how to mitigate them. We kicked it off last November with a workshop to really populate ideas from smaller groups as to what topics we should be addressing. So we took those topics, everything from how do you identify the risk, what should be in a mitigation plan, what are the financial risks and how the utilities can mitigate that financial risk. How can utility commissions consider the financial impact on customers, and how do we understand cost-effective mitigation practices? And so those are some of the topics that we're covering. And so we've got a steering committee convened with commissioners, staff, utilities, and others from across the country, from every NARUC region. NARUC has 5 regions. The West, which we understand it's huge. We know the West is different, but that's a big region. And then the Midwest, the Northeast, the Southeast, and the Mid-Atlantic region. And I think at first some of the folks from the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic and even the Northeast were a little questioning why they should get involved in this. And then last year we had fires in New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Texas routinely have fires, and even in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And then we got response. So we've got people joining in. We meet about once a month. The NARUC staff are taking the topics that were identified, working with a group of what we call our Tiger team of experts, reaching out to folks and collecting ideas on what should be in the chapter. Then they go back and draft the chapter, and then we all review the chapter, and we are working through this with the goal of having it available the end of October, early November, in time for the NARUC meeting, with the annual meeting, which will be in Seattle in November. And
Coronation.
The coronation, yes. It's planned to be an online tool so that it will have links to wildfire plans that utilities have, to information. We've been partnering a lot with the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety in California. The director there, Caroline Thomas Jacobs, has been an amazing resource. Folks like Technosilva and Pano and other companies that have technology resources that we can identify, and just providing case studies and examples so that when states are beginning to evaluate this, that they have examples. So we're not this is not to tell folks what you have to do and how you have to do it, but as you're approaching this risk, what are the ways other folks have addressed it? So that's the plan.
Probably it's not accurate to say best practices so much as it is a menu of practices you can evaluate and apply in your particular situation.
Right, because it's a really dynamic landscape. Things are changing, and techniques and technologies and practices are changing. And utilities are working together and figuring out what really works and what doesn't work. And so I would say it's more current successful strategies, and those strategies are changing and evolving over time.
And NARIC coordinates very closely with CAMPUT on the regulatory side.
Yes, CAMPUT. And we're also working with the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, NASUCA. I had to think about what that acronym was. We've got representatives from NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislators, on the steering committee. And so we are really trying to bring in other organizations that are facing the same issue so we can really coordinate and work effectively together.
And then Michelle, similarly within EEI, and Mary Kipp is one of the co-chairs there, EEI coordinates with its Canadian counterpart, Electricity Canada, at a very, very close level.
Yes, and I'm not familiar with what Mary does specifically with them, but I do know Mary obviously brings back all of the work that she's doing with EEI. And we've talked a little bit about it here, but the idea that, you know, utilities used to be a place where it's a safe investment, low risk investment. And now we're hearing how that landscape has changed. And so we really do need federal and then the aligning state and local policies to make sure that the utilities can shoulder this burden. But the four things that they're working on at EEI, one is the FEMA assistance that you might get during an event. Utilities are on the hook to pay that back. So we just don't know if that makes sense in the needs of the community where you would ultimately be paying for that anyway. So we want to take a look at that. There's bipartisan legislation for Fix Our Forest, which is all the federal lands that make up our landscape, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, what that land management strategy could and should be to make sure that we're reducing risk, the liability, standard of care, and then ultimately whether or not there's some sort of federal fund similar to maybe what California has, but then is there as a backstop for utilities and customers, keeping an eye out on affordability and the ability to rebuild if necessary.
Joaquin, you personally and Techno Silva have been building those kinds of networks, those relationships, before probably most of us in the room were even thinking about the issue. And that's one of the reasons that you and Dr. Hesper go so far back. Talk about how the larger wildfire community is coordinating and what you're working on there.
Well, we're definitely living an exciting time on that regard because what happened in the last 10 years is really making everybody's eyes open that, again, we have to be from just fighting the problem to be proactively working in the problem. And that, again, is just sometimes take a leader to take the action. And in our case, as I mentioned, I've been working with wildfire agencies for so many years. Wildfire agencies typically the science has been typically underfunded, dramatically underfunded, very little. There's many areas that the funding is there with the AI and all of that. That kind of, we have the Pacific Northwest Research Lab here with wonderful scientists, the Missoula Lab, and they've been really, really underfunded all this time. And it was by working with the utilities that because of the huge pressure that was on top of them that they advanced. And they advanced, okay, we need better science, we need better models, we need better field, we need cameras, we need all this technology. And personally, it was very satisfying to see that, okay, this is not your problem only, you need your partners, you need whatever is your line going through, you need to talk to that people that is managing that land because it doesn't matter that you clear your power line if the Forest Service, which manages this area, is not taking care of the surrounded area or the state or that community is not ready. So we started the conversation first in San Diego, then in California, and now it's the collaboration that started on those days. And Commissioner mentioned the collaboration that came from California this time. Now is the standard, and that is fantastic. We're showing the path to others that this is the only way that we can move along and create this progress that is needed. Because, well, it's not that we have to create fire adapted communities. We need to be really starting by being fire accepted community. We need to accept that this is happening. How we're ready, it depends on us. And that's done by this collaboration that is not only the utility side, it's all these partners that we're talking about.
I would invite all of you to jump in on any of these questions, both nodding your heads during those comments. What are your takeaways from this?
So I think one of the things we haven't talked about yet is it really focused on that financial risk, because utilities, whether they are investor-owned or consumer-owned utilities, they rely on access to capital. And it's different capital for municipal utilities than it is for investor-owned utilities. But the equity analysts and the credit analysts are taking note, and including wildfire risk in their risk elements of how they evaluate what they're going to, what sort of risk a utility is in. They're looking at whether utilities have wildfire plans. They're looking at whether utilities have a public safety power shutoff plan. Anytime there is a fire, one of the first things I get, and I get information from the equity analysts all the time about companies, and it's not just the ones I regulate, but if there's a fire, the first thing they do is there's sort of a hesitancy and a risk, like, well, there might be an impact. You saw it in Hawaii when the fire started. Immediately, Hawaii Utilities Hawaiian Electric was downgraded, and it really impacts their ability to respond to the risk and then be a going concern going forward. And so it is, I think that in and of itself has really created more of a national focus for the utilities, because if the utilities are paying more for the investment they need to make, A, to make their systems more resilient for wildfire and other extreme weather, B, in the West, we have a shortage of electric capacity right now. So they need to build capacity to serve customers. And then there's the demand growth from AI for data centers. And so there's a need for capital to do all of these things. And if they have no access to it, or it's so expensive, then that's going to fall on customers. And then the commissions are going to say, well, what were you doing to reduce your risk so you didn't have to pay that much for capital costs? And maybe we're not going to give you the recovery that you think you should, because maybe you weren't doing everything you should have been doing. So it's a very circular issue, but it's a huge financial risk that underlies this whole issue.
I give a lot of credit to regulators of all kinds for stepping up and thinking about that subject very broadly. Just editorially, I always think, and I essentially said this yesterday, think of utility providers, energy infrastructure providers, as stewards of the most basic infrastructure, providers of the most critical service. Because this industry is so deeply regulated, regulators, particularly at the state level, are almost co-stewards, and you have a responsibility to be sure rates are fair and infrastructure is safe enough.
But I think the issue is also there for municipal and other consumer
100%.
utilities who rely on bonding primarily for their funding, and the same risk is there. And they're much smaller and, have less access to capital in some ways. So it's not just an investor and utility issue. No,
it is entirely. You are subject, at the very least, to credit ratings review, preparedness for wildfire, what regulatory actions are being undertaken in a state are all part of that review. And that's one of the many reasons it's so important that regulators, city councils, municipal utility boards, co-op boards are all stepping up and really engaging. Michelle, what does this look like, the set of financial risks from your perspective?
Sure. So I don't think on the financial aspects of it much different than what my colleagues have said up here. But I think when it comes to when I look at my team, so my team is primarily responsible for the operating, the maintaining, the designing of the grid. And we just mentioned all of the challenges that we're trying to juggle at the same time. So I think it's on us, especially when we're thinking about our impact to our customers, is making sure that those investments really count. So how are we prioritizing our investments? And then what is the data that we're using to support the prudency of our investment, not only to reduce risk, but then also to just make sure that we're getting the outcome that we're looking for. And whether that's implementing and then making sure that we've actually seen that result or we're predicting. So we're really trying to bring together the data. It's interesting being both a gas and electric utility, because on the gas system, we've had a lot of transparency and tracking of equipment and kind of procedures that go into maintaining and operating the gas system. You're seeing that bleed over onto the electric side because we need that sort of detail to make these critical decisions. And so that's going to continue to evolve. But while we're transitioning, there's lots of data gaps. So it's great that all this is coming together at the same time. But again, it's going to come down to prioritization and making sure that we're having the impact for reliability, safety, our clean goals, our ability to have people connect to the system and growth on the system. So really threading all those needles the best that we can.
So that's interesting, since you're responsible for both gas and electric. Gas system heavily regulated from the federal level down, a mature system of regulation, and really driven by a risk analysis that you have to conduct of your own system. And essentially, you're bringing that over.
Absolutely. And sort of to that point, so we're leveraging the lessons learned on the gas side. But when we think about wildfire, it really, here in the Pacific Northwest, I need to leverage every sort of emergency management activity to learn more about my customers, my vulnerable communities, my system's vulnerabilities, to make sure that we're best positioned for wildfire season. We just went through, if you're from this region, but the bomb cyclone that we had in November, we are going to be more prepared for our PSPS activities because of that bomb cyclone. So it's really taking every set of opportunities to make the best investment decisions possible for the system and for our customers.
I wanted to ask you about that specifically. Just by coincidence, I was in Seattle for an event kind of like this the night before. Your whole team was mobilizing. You had crews from contract crews, even from out of state, ready to go that night. The storm hit incredibly hard. Actually, I was impressed. Mary was going to be on a panel the next morning. She showed up in dirty jeans and work boots, did the panel, and then went back to work. But say some more about how, actually, I think this is something I'd love to hear all of you speak to, how preparedness for one situation can be beneficial in other situations, well, other kinds of extreme events, or simply improving reliability.
Well, I certainly, that example is a great example. But I think as, when we started this discussion on our service territory in particular, we might have more wildfire activity in the eastern part of our service territory. The western part of our service territory has a different set of risk that we're constant. Of course, if we ever have if and when we have the earthquake, that will probably have a bigger impact on the western part of our service territory. So of course, we want to leverage all of the activities that we're doing in both parts to make the system more resilient in general. And then just also preparing those communities. I think looking down at California, the one advantage aside from, the upgrades that they made to their system, but their communities really know about wildfire risk. I think Washingtonians in general are, we're still on the beginning part of that curve. And so if they can think about, hey, a power outage in the wintertime, think about that in the summertime. I actually was just on a call with a key account earlier last week, and they were talking to me about what the impacts of our critical fire weather operating procedures might be on them. They're a wastewater treatment facility. And I said, yes, think about during a big storm event, you're dealing with the volume of water that's coming through your system. If you lose power, you have backup generation, you're sizing that. Now think about, what are you doing in the summer months? You're probably doing some sort of maintenance. If you don't have the power to do that, how does that impact your maintenance cycle or what you might do during the summer? So it's really just trying to get people to think about, hey, this is how I've prepared for electrical or energy outages, in my business in general. How do I then apply that to wildfire season, where I just might see more outages? And until the utility gets to a point where we can be more resilient and put all the infrastructure to be more resilient, where we don't have to de-energize to make safe.
Do you see those benefits too, Ann?
Oh, yeah, I would say that, so there's four things I would talk about. One is the resilience investments that you're making through vegetation management, through making your poles and wires more resilient to wind, which is a key factor for any of these events, that you're hardening your system, but not to a standard that, to a reasonable standard, because of course customers can't pay for it. They can't afford everything. So we have to make sure we're doing it, as you said, in a prioritized manner and reasonable. What are the hardest hit places we need to focus on? That you're communicating with your customers about all of these potential risks to them, how they can prepare, understanding that customer base, who is hit hardest, and how do you communicate with those communities? Some of them may be primarily, Russian speaking, Spanish speaking. How are you communicating with those communities that need to hear in multiple different ways? You can't just send a text alert. Not everybody's going to get it. You've got to find different ways to communicate with the different sectors. Communicating with the first responders and the emergency management, making sure that you are doing the tabletops or sessions in advance of both winter and summer, so that you're prepared for when an event happens. Who you're going to talk to, who those key people are in the cities that might be affected. So it's the customers, it's the communities, it's the resilience investments that are going to help you across the board. And then of course I forgot the last one, but I think it's just all of the above. Really, you have to think ahead for what might happen, prepare for that, the plan for how you're going to respond. And it's not just within the utility, it's within the community of utilities, it's within the communities, it's the emergency management and the officials in those communities, so they understand what's going on.
Techno Silva, I want to actually bring you in on a couple of different threads of this conversation. First, you work directly with the insurance sector, and there's an awful lot of activity there. Insurance, wildfire insurance is more and more expensive for less and less insurance. You also field incoming, both from equity investors and from ratings agents. I'd love to have you speak about that. The other subject, we think of you as the wildfire company, and within Penwar world, you are that, to be sure. But you're also kind of very similar to this conversation. You're also using that technology in very impactful ways for other major events as well. If you could touch on those two unrelated but both important subjects.
Okay, I'll start with the last one, connects a little more here. Preparedness is the basics of reducing the impact from the get-go. Okay, we may have the same event between a community has been prepared and ready and understand what they're facing, and another one that doesn't understand what it's facing and just rely on firefighters again. And the impacts are going to be totally different, although the phenomena is the same, right? So preparedness is key at every level, both in the agencies, but also for the citizens. And preparedness to live where we live. We need to understand where we live. And sometimes where we are in a community that is only 100 years old, and I say only, but it seems a lot of time. Well, I come from a city that is 2,000 years old. And our preparedness for floods it's very easy. You go to church and you see the line where the water level arrived in 1515 and then in 1765, and that helps you to the case to be ready when they tell you, okay, a flood is coming, you know what we're talking about. So we live in a wonderful land that is the engine of the world's economy. The growth in this part of the world is incredible. 100 years ago, the landscape was different than it is right now. We're encroaching the growth to have affordable housing, to have our communities growing in these areas. And the reality is that we have done, I would say, half of the job. When we build a community, when we provide energy to a community, we need to understand that people that are going there, they need to understand they have to live in a sustainable way. And that means that a bad event may happen once every 10 years or once every 20 years, right? And you have to be ready. And you have to decide if we're going to be ready. When we're looking at other kind of extreme events that are easier to identify, like what happened tragically in Texas recently, that floodplain where Camp Mystic was a 10 years floodplain. It wasn't a 100 years floodplain. That area was flooded every 10 years. You decide to be there, is your choice. But being ready is really easy. It is really easy. And we know how to do it. And we started to build, probably, I don't know if people is familiar with the incident command system or the National Incident Management System. The utilities in California start to manage this kind of events through this incident management system, National Management Incident System. So we can address both wildfires or a PSPS or a vegetation management plan or a flood or a drill for an earthquake. And the key to be less impacted is by educating and train and implement it. And a plan is not implemented if you don't train it. And that's the critical part where we need the help of our citizens. On the other side, we have the two actors that you mentioned. We have the insurance market. We have also the investment, or the money, or the financial risk that not only utilities, our communities are facing. Because at the end of the day, who is paying for those $13.5 billion that PG&E had to pay? All of us that live in California. That's the reality, right? So one of the biggest problems that we face with the insurance market, we started to try to talk to them 15 years ago. They didn't care. They said the wildfire was the 7th natural risk that they care about. And they were facing the problem with, with models that were like, stochastic models that were looking at 100,000 years of hypothetical weather. But to be honest, that wasn't impacting properly the way that communities can be impacted. And if we talk about these big fires, okay, let's see what just happened in Altadena. Eaton Fire is going to change even more this. It's going to make it so hard to live in California that it's going to be really, we need to change the way that we do things. So the insurance market, at the end of the day, they are risk averse. And what they have to trust is in the models that they manage to say, okay, well, we're going to give you a policy or we're going to reinsurance your business because we think that your risk is accurate and you are working towards it. But right now, we're in that transition moment. And what we're facing, mostly in the west of the US and in Canada, it is that insurance is becoming a huge problem with everybody until we understand, or they understand, that they are also part of the solution together.
That's insurance for the electric companies, for municipalities, electric companies of every kind, for municipalities, and ultimately for homeowners as well.
And the business owners, right?
Love to get some discussion. And the app is also available. But for people who've had their powder milk biscuits and aren't too shy this morning, I'd love to hear from you live as well. Please, and if you could tell us who you are and where you're from.
I'm Travis Nelson. I'm with the Washington PUD Association, Lifetime and Environmental Regulatory. So this is very interesting to me. So it strikes me as interesting that we're talking about utilities, as you mentioned, being like 10% of the fires that are caused or less are from utilities. Yet we have a great focus right now because of recent experiences on utilities being kind of the focus. And I was encouraged to hear in a talk this morning, and again from, my background being I worked as a fish biologist for Department of Fish and Wildlife for 20 years, is forest land management as well as rangeland management has really influenced, and frankly, land use planning has really influenced where we are today with our fire risk. And the way that we continue to look at it as it's climate change. Yes, and we've done this thing for 100 years here plus, where we have a very strong environmental ethic, which is a good thing. I can say that. I enjoy catching my salmon and having forests to go and walk in. However, I think that, Anne, you mentioned this, you alluded to this, I think it's important that the burden and the awareness of the responsibility of doing the right things right, like development, where do we put our population centers? Who shares that burden of risk is shared amongst the community that lives there. Meaning that if you want to live in an area adjacent to or within a forest, you have to be educated and understanding and accept some level of risk. And I think that our policies and regulation are having a hard time catching up right now. I think we've spent a long time focusing on protecting the forest, which is a good thing, but we've backed away from some of the practices, as it turns out, that we're learning now were responsible and good practices, meaning reducing the fuel sources and also trying to do, as we saw this morning after breakfast, reducing the fire recurrence intervals, the impact of those fires by doing, more prescribed burns and just being thoughtful of it, because I like clean air as much as anybody else. But I believe that what we're seeing right now in my lifetime of living in the state of Washington, we're seeing more. I don't remember as a kid having smoke so thick in Puget Sound in the month of September like we did a few years ago from the fires up north. And that's going to, I think, potentially be something that we have more regularly. And I think we might be already behind the 8 ball. Now, that's a long statement of opinion and some observations I've had this morning, but I'd be curious to hear from any of you, like a response or a thought around some of the things I mentioned.
What you just did was really synthesize all of these important themes that we've been developing over the morning, the comprehensive solution to a very complex set of challenges, many of which are the result of perfectly good intentions. And I have to ask, why did you stop becoming a fish biologist? That's on my top 10 list of cool jobs.
So for me, I'm a public servant first, right? And love the opportunity to help people solve problems. And so in the Pacific Northwest, we have salmon as an icon species. That's my focus as a salmon biologist. And I wanted to try to help continue to serve. And, the consumer operated utilities, being PUDs, I think is one of the places that I found to be some of the folks that still get that it's about public service. It's about helping each other in your community. And I figured environmental is a big thing in our state. And that's why I wouldn't say I quit, but I've evolved to another level and trying to help folks talk to each other. And it's a really important thing, I think.
I'm very glad I asked you that question, because what you just described, I think, is something that motivates probably most people in this room, certainly the folks up here. So great question.
So from my vantage, and in my role, I just regulate investor-owned utilities in Washington, and I don't have a role regulating the consumer-owned utilities, but have a very good appreciation for the work that your members do. You're closer to your communities in many ways. You tend to be smaller and serving, you're member driven. So I think there's an opportunity for those utilities to really work with their communities and educate, just like the larger utilities are working to identify specific communities in the larger area that they serve, to talk about what is something that a customer can do to protect their house if there was a fire, having that defensible space around what are the, so there's communication that can happen in the community, as well as creating a plan for if something were to happen. And I think the utilities have a role in helping to educate the customers about Avista has a right tree, right place program. Is the tree that you planted next to your house really the right one to plant next to your house? Is it a species that's going to catch fire right away? Is it growing so fast into the fire line? You know, there's so many things that you can do in communicating with the customers. But utilities are not, you know, they are the cause of some of the more catastrophic fires, but they're not the sole cause of all the fires. You know, we have lightning strike fires in all the forested lands in Washington that can create these really catastrophic fires, even though they're not as close to more urban environments. But there are some consumer and utilities like Chelan Public Utilities District that I think they were the first one in the state to have a public safety power shutoff and to work on that. So I think there's a lot of learning that happens with the entire utility community. But I think that the investor in utilities tend to be in some ways more at risk financially. But everyone's facing the insurance risk. That insurance risk is huge and the costs are tremendous. And it's not just for the utilities, it's for customers. Customers can't afford liability insurance either in some areas.
I just want to add that the number is right. Between 3 and 10% is the number of fires caused by utilities. The problem is that the ignition cost on those events typically is through strong wind conditions, like extraordinary wind conditions, because utilities are designed at engineering levels that just can't support those conditions. The problem is when those conditions are really, really extreme, and that makes that those little fires are big, and that's the reason they're very impactful. So that's one side. But the other thing that I mentioned, really appreciate your comment. I think that, you know, in the fire community, we always love to talk about triangles, the fire triangle with the, you know, the vegetation and with the topography and with the ignitions. I think that we need to think also the sustainable development of any society has to also be focused that we need to have a triangle that is balanced, and that's a balance between the society, the ecological factors, and the economy. If those are unbalanced, we're doomed. If we just focus too much on the environmental area, I would say that, for example, in the 90s, it was mostly banned, prescribed burns during the 90s because the Clean Air Act. That was a very strong environmental process, as it happened in Europe right now with the protective of all the natural lands. Right now, we're having the biggest, more impactful fire that we have in Europe or in the West, due to the lack of management through prescribed burn or through grazing or through any kind of activity. So prescribed burn, yes. Thinning and forest management, yes. Any kind, biomass, we try to get the biochip from the wood, yes. Anything that help us, that our community is balanced, that triangle, that will make a community that is sustainable. If not, that won't happen, right?
Other questions?
I'll take one. Hi, Nate Hill with Amazon. Nice to see you. I remember that panel, Bob, after the storm with Mary.
It was a
Yeah.
good panel. I was delighted
That was
to
fun
be
to be on.
there, and I was very happy, actually, in that case, that Seattle City Light kept the power on.
That's right. Yeah. I guess my question, kind of building on Ann's previous comment and then something Michelle said earlier, from a customer behavior perspective, just out of curiosity, are going beyond planting trees not near your house or any of those fire mitigation measures, are you seeing upticks or meaningful adoption of more extreme, like islanding capability out to manage fire risk, or something more along the lines of, you know, what we see in California now? You said we're sort of on the early days of what they've went through in that state. Are we starting to see those emerge, those sort of customer behavior trends of new technology and islanding capability?
So technology, both specific applications, you've talked about kind of moving from one shot to more visibility and control, but also how you architect the network.
Sure. So some of the technologies that we see down in California show up just from a reliability perspective in our service territory. So I got emails from customers during the bomb cyclone that they had 2 Tesla battery walls in their garage and how they use that. So that is being introduced in our service territory. So then how do you take that a step farther, or at least specific to wildfire? So certainly consumers are making their own decisions about the reliability that they want where they live. But we are also taking a look at what is the best mechanism to reduce risk on a circuit. And in some cases, it might be a microgrid. If I can disconnect you from the service and keep you energized, but alleviate the concern of that overhead power line going to that community, then that might be the best solution for that area. We know about undergrounding, but I can talk about that, the continuum that we see on mitigating for wildfire risk. You talk to the California utilities, they're almost up to a point that they're just, what else do we do and at what cost? And then what does that mean for consumers? So, we're in the beginning stages of that, but we benefit from being able to learn from their challenges. And so we are trying to integrate that in to drive as much efficiency into our program as possible. And so we're going to continue to do that, but we do see it on the reliability, whether it's a winter storm or a wildfire event.
So before we have what I think will be our last question, be thinking about your advice to all the tremendous people here at Penwar. What do you want to take away?
Right. Good morning. This is a great panel. I'm Dave Arbaugh, and I represent a number of utilities here in Washington State. My question springs off an earlier panel on this subject, where one of the recommendations was to develop locally driven solutions and responses and strategies. And so I'm wondering, with the experience PSE has and with the experience Commissioner Rendall with the NARUC effort, how that manifests itself. That's probably a critical factor for many of the consumer-owned utilities that are serving customers here.
Can you just restate the beginning of that?
Well, yeah, one of the recommendations from an earlier panel was that communities should develop local strategies and responses to mitigate or deal with the wildfire risks. And so, like in the PSC example, I'm assuming you spend a lot of time communicating with customers, and I'm curious about how that local community orientation works with your approach.
Okay, thank you for repeating that. So our efforts for wildfire awareness, wildfire mitigation awareness is all year round. And I think one of the more intriguing things that we did in the last year is after fire season, we actually polled customers to see what the understanding of our programs were at the end of the season. So all the efforts that we did, and I mean, tens of thousands of communication, whether it was hard paper copy or emails or social media, whatever it might be. And then at the end of the season, we saw what our penetration was. And then interestingly enough, although our Eastern communities had more awareness, the actual percentage of the understanding of our programs was pretty equal across our service territory. So when we understand that, we can think about what mechanisms that we really need to lean into, especially for the communities that are the highest risk. Just this past weekend, Vashon Strawberry Festival, I don't know if anyone frequented that. I went over to that and we had a booth there. And speaking of which, I do have 3 flyers up here on the front table. If you're interested in our programs, got 3 flyers up here that you can take with you. But the important part is, as community members walk by, we can answer questions for them. So if they've seen, whether it's a vegetation management crew in their area, or we've shared something on our website that said what the wildfire mitigation grid hardening strategies are in that community, they can come up, ask those questions. And so we do try to take as a targeted approach as we possibly can, because we absolutely need to. It will look different for certain parts of our service territory than others. And we acknowledge that. And we do just want to make sure that we are accomplishing the understanding that we're going to need to be a more resilient community.
And I'll just add that in our conversations with the utilities, we stress that it's not just the programs they're doing, it's the coordination they're having with the communities, with the first responders, with making sure they know who the contact person is in a particular city or town or county. So when something happens, and that they've had those communications in advance, so they knew who to call to mobilize efforts so that those communities can can develop their system to notify each other so that it's not just on the utility to communicate with the community. It's a community effort. And really to understand, as I mentioned before, who are those in the community that are going to need more assistance, either they have mobility issues, if there's going to be an evacuation, or if there's a PSPS, people who are medical customers who need electricity to serve their devices. So it's a, in different languages. So it's really understanding the community and working within the communities to make sure that everyone is focused and ready.
Tecto Silva's analysis is sufficiently granular, as I understand it, that you can support that kind of community level work.
Yeah, that's that we do is a focus on, instead of looking at who started a fire, is how exposed we are to a fire, and that can be done proactively. Exactly as the utility can understand what is happening in the next 5 days, the communities also can understand what is there, that is there. And as a final thought, I would say that, well, we are in the, the cradle of innovation. This is where most of the technology that the world is using, it is here. We are surrounded by one of the most pristine landscapes in the world. And we have also the Native Americans, the First Nations that really understood how to live in balance. We screwed up a little in the last years, but we have also I'll add to that, the great academic institutions that we have, like UBC, like UDAP, that we have all the understanding, the data, the science, the technology. It is here. It was born here, and we have that cultural understanding. So I think it's a question to identify, okay, how we take action, because we know what needs to be done. We listen from Paul Hesburgh. We have all the ammunition to do it. It's just a question to identify which are those barriers that prevent us to be more ready to address these challenges. I would say that is something doable, that is there, and that we can all together get significant advances in short term if needed.
Continuing with final thoughts.
So from the investor and utility regulator position, it's just really important for me and for commissioners across the country to really understand this risk, to be just like the utilities are preparing to mitigate the risk. How are the commissions preparing to understand the risk, be able to work with the utilities to make sure they're appropriately responding to the risk, and then communicating that to our partners. And so make sure we are not contributing to a problem.
And I would just say, from the utility perspective, we take full accountability for the work that we need to do to reduce the risk. I am really proud to be in an industry that can collaborate around this issue. I think, like the panel that was in this room before us, they were talking about economic prosperity, and they were talking about how communities came together during COVID. I think this is an issue where maybe we're not getting it completely right, but it is really encouraging how, whether it's the technology, the utilities, regulators, are all coming together to try to help mitigate this risk. And, I'm really proud of my team and the work that we're all doing to try to make it better.
So first, I want to thank all of you for your long-term commitment to public service through Penwar and when you go home as well. Secondly, we heard the applause from next door, and I'm sure that was incredibly well-deserved. I have to think that these three dedicated professionals deserve at least twice as loud a round of applause. So if you would join me in thanking them.